The clinking of sterling silver against fine French porcelain had never sounded so cold. My name is Charlotte Montgomery. At 8 o'clock that evening, in the grand formal dining room of Highcliff Manor, I became the legal wife of Julian Montgomery. There was no music, no laughter, and no celebration, only a stiff three-course dinner served under the watchful gaze of a dozen oil portraits, ancestors with severe jaws and hollow eyes, looking down from the wainscoted walls as if a stray alley bird had wandered onto their private estate. I wore a simple, unadorned silk tea gown of ivory crepe-line. It had no imported Belgian lace or sewn seed pearls, only clean lines and modest seams. At the head of the 40-foot mahogany table sat Eleanor Montgomery. She wore emerald velvet with diamonds pinned at her throat, her posture as rigid as iron. She had not touched her roast squab. Instead, she spent the meal turning a crystal goblet of claret in her gloved fingers, watching my every movement with open, aristocratic disgust. Across from me sat my new husband, Julian. He was quiet, 30 years old, with sharp, observant gray eyes and a pale, drawn face from months of illness. He barely spoke, keeping his head low while his mother commanded the room like an empress reviewing a common prisoner. When the footman cleared the second course, Eleanor tapped her silver dessert spoon against the crystal goblet. The sharp ring echoed off the high plaster ceilings. "Put down your fork, Charlotte," Eleanor said, her voice smooth, cutting, and loud enough to freeze every servant standing along the wall. I set my fork down on the linen napkin, folded my hands in my lap, and looked directly down the table at her. "Yes, Mrs. Montgomery?" Eleanor let out a short, mocking breath that barely ruffled the lace on her bodice. "Do not call me that," she said, leaning forward just enough so the candlelight caught the sharp angles of her cheekbones. "You may wear the gold band my son placed on your finger an hour ago, but you are not a Montgomery. You are nothing more than a charity case, a quiet little clerk's daughter brought in through the side door to act as a hired nurse for a sickly heir." Julian's knuckles whitened against his linen napkin, but he kept his eyes on his plate. "Mother," Julian murmured, his voice strained. "Silence, Julian," Eleanor snapped without glancing in his direction. Her pale eyes remained locked onto me. "Your quarters have been prepared in the East Servants' Wing," Eleanor said with a cold, dismissive smirk. "Eat your supper, pack your meager trunk, and be out of this dining hall before the morning staff arrives. You will remain in that wing until I find a use for you." She stood up, smoothing down her velvet skirts without a backward glance, and swept out of the dining room into the parlor. The room fell dead silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the Atlantic wind rattling the leaded glass windows. I didn't tremble. I didn't reach for a handkerchief. I looked down at the cold iron key on the table. Eleanor thought she had bought herself a quiet, broken girl who would hide in the East Wing and accept her scraps. She had no idea that my late father hadn't just been a clerk, and she had no idea whose signature was on the original maritime bond that kept this entire manor from sinking into debt. The East Wing of Highcliff Manor was cold, smelling of damp limestone and neglected cedar. My assigned room was small, tucked behind the old linen closets, with a narrow iron bedstead and a single brass candlestick. But I didn't unpack my trunk. I didn't even take off my ivory wedding gown. I set the candle on the small writing desk, pulled the heavy wool shawl tighter around my shoulders, and waited. Just past midnight, the floorboards in the hallway creaked with a slow, deliberate rhythm. A quiet, double tap sounded against my door. I turned the brass latch and pulled the door open. Julian stood in the dim corridor. He had discarded his formal black dinner jacket, wearing only a crisp white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. The fragile, sickly look he wore in front of his mother at the dinner table was completely gone. In its place were sharp, focused eyes and a jaw set with quiet determination. "May I come in, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "It is your house, Mr. Montgomery," I replied, stepping aside. "No," Julian said, stepping into the room and closing the heavy door behind him until the latch clicked shut. "It isn't my house. Not yet. And as long as my mother controls the family ledger, it won't belong to either of us." He walked over to the desk and pulled a folded sheaf of ledger papers from his pocket and laid them beside the candle. "I owe you an apology for tonight," Julian said, looking directly at me. "I had to let her believe you were powerless. If she thought for a second that our marriage was anything more than a desperate arrangement to satisfy the family council, she would have blocked it before the ink on the register was dry." "I am not fragile, Julian," I said, meeting his gaze. "I grew up in the shipping offices in Boston. I spent 10 years watching men like your mother's associates try to bully my father out of his harbor slips. I know what a hostile takeover looks like." A faint, respectful smile crossed Julian's lips. "Then you already know what she's planning," Julian murmured. "My mother has squandered over $200,000 of the Montgomery Line's capital on bad railroad speculation and luxury European loans. The creditors are closing in. Her only plan to save herself is to declare me incapacitated, annul our marriage before the new year, and force a merger with the Vance rail dynasty." I walked to the desk and unfolded the shipping manifests Julian had brought. My eyes skimmed the columns of cargo numbers, port duties, and freight seals. My father had taught me how to read between the lines of maritime books since I was 12 years old. "These fuel vouchers are forged." I tapped the bottom row of the third page. "The tonnage listed for the December coal shipment through Boston Harbor is doubled, but the draft clearance signatures don't match the Port Authority stamps." Julian's eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. "She's siphoning the freight profits into an offshore holding account to hide her personal debts," Julian confirmed, leaning closer over the papers. "She plans to announce my betrothal to Lydia Vance at the New Year's Gala in 2 weeks. If she signs those merger agreements, the Montgomery shipping fleet will be dissolved, and 500 dock workers will lose their livelihoods." "She won't sign them," I said quietly, looking from the papers back to my husband, "because she doesn't hold the foundational title to the fleet." Julian frowned slightly, tilting his head. "What do you mean? The original 1904 consortium charter was registered by my grandfather. Your grandfather entered that partnership with a silent backer, a man who supplied the first 3 steam cargo vessels and retained 49% of the sovereign maritime bonds that transfer to his sole surviving heir upon marriage." I looked into Julian's eyes as the realization hit him. "My father didn't just work for the Montgomery Line, Julian. I owned the foundation under your mother's feet. The original sealed charter is locked in the safe in the Manor Library, and before this month ends, we are going to open it." By Thursday evening, a heavy coastal fog had rolled in off the Atlantic, pressing thick and white against the leaded windows of Highcliff Manor. Downstairs, in the grand salon, Eleanor was hosting her weekly high-stakes bridge evening for the county elite. The muffled hum of piano music, clinking champagne glasses, and bursts of aristocratic laughter drifted up through the ventilation grates. It was the only night of the week when the main hallway was clear and the household staff were occupied with service in the west parlor. I stepped out of my East Wing quarters wearing soft-soled slippers and a dark woolen dress, moving down the service corridor like a shadow. The manor library sat on the second floor behind two towering doors of carved English oak. It was the private domain of the late master of Highcliff, a room Eleanor kept under strict lock and key to maintain control over the family's legal affairs. Julian met me at the landing, slipping a small brass key into the lock. It turned with a muffled click. We stepped inside and closed the heavy door behind us. The library smelled of old Moroccan leather, cedar smoke, and yellowed parchment. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of leather-bound volumes, illuminated only by the faint silver moonlight cutting through the mist outside. "The safe is behind the oil portrait of the 1904 flagship," Julian whispered, leading me toward the marble mantelpiece at the far end of the room. He carefully swung the heavy gilded frame aside. Embedded deep within the brick chimney wall was a massive Diebold steel safe, its dial gleaming in the dim light. "My mother changes the combination every 6 months," Julian murmured, his brow furrowed as his fingers rested on the dial. "My father gave me the key to this vault when I was 16, Julian," I said softly, stepping up beside him. "It isn't a modern combination. It's an old maritime coordinate sequence based on the harbor founding charter." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, recalling the sequence my father had made me memorize before he fell ill. 24 north, 11 west, 36 south. I placed my fingers on the cold steel dial. Turn right to 24. A soft internal catch clicked. Turn left past 0 to 11. Another satisfying metallic drop. Turn right to 36. With a deep, heavy thump, the central locking bolt disengaged. Julian let out a quiet breath as I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside the dark velvet compartment lay bundles of bearer bonds, a stack of promissory notes, and at the very bottom a thick ribbon-tied folder of heavy cream vellum sealed with the crimson wax stamp of the Massachusetts Maritime Board. I lifted the folder and carried it to the leather-topped desk, using the faint moonlight to read the embossed header, "The 1904 Highcliff Harbor and Freight Consortium Charter." As Julian and I turned the brittle pages, the undeniable truth lay bare in clean, indelible ink. My father, Arthur Cole, had not simply backed the fleet with 3 ships. The charter explicitly stated that 60% of the deep-water docking rights and 49% of the company voting shares were held in a non-transferable trust, designated exclusively to Arthur Cole's direct lineage. Even more damning was the private audit tucked into the final sleeve. Eleanor's signature appeared on dozens of illegal ledger transfers, showing she had secretly mortgaged the company's operating assets to cover personal social debts, gambling losses in Newport, and lavish European vacations. Under the terms of the founding charter, any unauthorized hypothecation of fleet assets gave the Cole estate the immediate legal authority to seize full executive control of the company and freeze all associated household trusts. "She doesn't own Highcliff," Julian whispered, staring at his mother's forged signatures in disbelief. "She never did. She's been living on your family's trust for 20 years. And she's about to sign away what was never hers to give," I said, carefully sliding the certified charter into my woolen coat. Downstairs, the piano music abruptly stopped, replaced by the sharp, familiar clatter of Eleanor's leather heels heading toward the grand staircase. The morning sun cutting through the frosted glass of the glass conservatory felt devoid of warmth.
I sat on a wrought iron garden bench, a cup of bitter black tea untouched in my hands. The air smelled of damp earth and forced winter orchids. Across from me, lounging on a wicker settee draped in ermine fur, sat Lydia Vance. Lydia was 24, sharp-featured and radiant with the effortless cruelty of unearned wealth. Her family owned the Northern Rail Line, and every line of her posture signaled that she believed she owned everyone in this room as well. The double doors of the conservatory clicked open, and Eleanor Montgomery swept in. She wore a morning gown of silver-gray damask, her diamond rings catching the cold light as she carried a black leather portfolio beneath her arm. She didn't look at me. She walked straight to Lydia, pressing a kiss to her powdered cheek. "Good morning, my dear Lydia," Eleanor purred, with her voice dripping with warmth that was never offered to anyone without a seven-figure trust. "I trust your ride from the station was pleasant." "Exquisite, Eleanor," Lydia replied, casting a slow, condescending glance in my direction, though I must admit I was surprised to find domestic help occupying the conservatory before breakfast. Eleanor let out a dry, breathy chuckle as she turned to face me, the warmth vanishing from her expression like frost under a flame. "She will not be occupying this space much longer, Lydia," Eleanor said. She stepped over to the iron table and dropped the leather portfolio onto the glass with a sharp crack. She unclasped the buckle and slid out 2 typed legal sheets, along with a green bank envelope. "Pick up the pen on the table, Charlotte," Eleanor commanded, her voice dropping into that familiar cutting cadence. "We are ending this ridiculous charade today." I looked down at the documents without touching the fountain pen. "What are these papers, Eleanor?" "A formal petition for marital dissolution on the grounds of unconsummated status and irreconcilable incompatibility." Eleanor rested both manicured hands on the back of the settee. Lydia smiled thinly, inspecting the polished crimson enamel on her fingernails. "It really is the kindest outcome for you, Charlotte. Julian requires a wife of stature and connections to navigate the railroad merger. A girl who kept freight manifests in Boston would only embarrass him in high society." "And inside that envelope," Eleanor added, tapping the thick green paper, "is $200 in cash, enough to secure a comfortable room in a boarding house down in Providence and purchase a train ticket back where you belong." "And if I refuse to sign?" I asked quietly, looking directly into Eleanor's pale eyes. Eleanor's smile hardened into a mask of pure venom. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper, yet vibrating with malice. "If you refuse, my dear, Dr. Prescott will arrive at 2 o'clock this afternoon. He has already prepared an affidavit certifying your profound mental hysteria and melancholia. You will be transported to the state asylum in Danvers before nightfall, where you will spend the rest of your quiet little life behind iron bars while Julian and Lydia wed in the spring." Lydia laughed, a high musical sound that echoed off the glass walls. "Take the $200, Charlotte. A girl like you has no power against families like ours." I looked at the legal petition, then at the green envelope, and finally back at Eleanor. My heart was beating in a steady, unhurried rhythm. "The New Year's Eve gala is tomorrow evening," I said softly, standing up from the bench. "I believe I will wait until then to make my final decision." "You have until 6 o'clock tonight," Eleanor spat, her eyes narrowing in irritation. "Sign those papers or you leave this house in a straitjacket." I gave a polite nod, smoothed down the pleats of my dark woolen skirt, and walked out of the conservatory without taking a single dollar. They thought a private doctor and a forged petition were enough to destroy me. They had no idea that while they were plotting my exile, Julian was already on the midday train to Boston to hand the maritime fraud files directly to the federal marshal. By 4 in the afternoon, the winter sky had turned the color of bruised iron. I remained in my East Wing quarters, the iron latch secured on the inside. The house below was alive with the frenzied commotion of 40 catering staff preparing for tomorrow night's grand New Year's Eve gala. Crates of champagne rattling against stone steps, the scent of roasting game birds drifting through the halls, and the sharp commands of Eleanor echoing from the foyer. At precisely 4:15, 3 distinct rhythmic taps sounded near the base of my service door. I unlocked the bolt and pulled the door open an inch. Standing in the shadows of the servant corridor was Thomas, the manor's head footman. He was a gray-haired man in his late 60s who had served the Montgomery line for over 30 years, a man who had known my father during the early shipyard days. "Miss Charlotte," Thomas whispered, his eyes darting down the narrow stairwell. "May I step in?" "Quickly, Thomas," I said, opening the door and ushering him into the room. Thomas closed the latch behind him, reached into the deep inner pocket of his woolen livery coat, and withdrew a heavy leather satchel bound with brass buckles. "Mr. Julian caught the express locomotive back from Boston 40 minutes ago. He couldn't risk coming directly up to this wing. Mrs. Eleanor has 2 of her private security guards watching the West Wing terrace. He instructed me to place this directly into your hands." I took the satchel and set it on the writing desk, unbuckling the leather straps. Inside lay 3 certified blue ribbon folios, embossed with the gold eagle seal of the Federal Maritime Court and the Federal Maritime Commission. Beside them was a small, velvet-lined mahogany jewel box. "The federal judge signed the emergency injunction at noon," Thomas murmured, watching me with profound respect. "All assets belonging to the Montgomery Shipping Corporation have been frozen under federal oversight, pending tonight's full audit. Mrs. Eleanor's private bank accounts in Boston and New York have been placed under federal receivership. She cannot transfer a single dollar, sell a single vessel, or sign any railroad merger with the Vance family." I opened the top folio. Julian's bold, angular signature sat beside the federal magistrate's seal, formally naming me the sole executor and primary fiduciary trustee of the 1904 Highcliff Harbor Trust. Then my eyes drifted to the mahogany box. I pressed the small brass catch, and the lid swung back. Resting against ivory silk was the historic Montgomery Duchess Parure, a breathtaking necklace and matching earrings of matched Colombian emeralds set in platinum filigree. It was the legendary heirloom of the founding family, hidden away in the central bank vault for 15 years after the death of Julian's grandmother, who had explicitly decreed in her will that the jewels could only be worn by the rightful mistress of the harbor. "Mr. Julian retrieved them from the Boston safety deposit this morning," Thomas whispered softly. "Mrs. Eleanor has searched for these stones for over a decade. She believes they were sold to cover early shipping debts." I touched the cool, flawless stones with the tips of my fingers. "And what of Dr. Prescott?" I asked, looking up at the loyal footman. A slow, wry smile touched Thomas's weathered face. "Sheriff Lawson intercepted Dr. Prescott's motor car at the county line an hour ago, Miss Charlotte. When the sheriff presented the federal magistrate's protective order signed on your behalf, Dr. Prescott turned his car right back towards the city. You are completely safe." I closed the velvet box with a firm, decisive click. "Thank you, Thomas," I said quietly. "Tell Julian everything is ready." "And what shall I tell the staff regarding your preparations for tomorrow evening, ma'am?" Thomas asked, bowing his head with genuine reverence. I looked out the frosted window toward the Atlantic surf crashing against the black rocks below. "Tell them to prepare the grand staircase. The true mistress of Highcliff is attending the gala." The grand ballroom of Highcliff Manor blazed with the light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers, reflecting off polished marble floors and towering gilded mirrors. It was 9 o'clock on New Year's Eve. Over 200 of New England's most powerful figures, railroad magnates, bank presidents, senators, and socialites in shimmering beaded gowns and tailored tuxedos, crowded the hall. The ensemble carpet played a jaunty foxtrot, but the true spectacle of the evening was taking place near the marble fireplace. Eleanor Montgomery stood on the raised dais, glowing with triumphant arrogance. She wore a dramatic gown of black velvet, holding a glass of vintage champagne. Beside her stood Lydia Vance, draped in French diamonds, smiling like a predator who had already claimed her prize. At 9:15, Eleanor raised her hand. The orchestra lowered their instruments, and the room gradually hushed to a complete, expectant silence. Honored guests, friends, and esteemed colleagues, Eleanor's voice boomed across the ballroom, smooth, resonant, and practiced. We gather tonight not only to welcome the new year, but to ensure the proud legacy of the Montgomery name. For decades, our shipping line has been the pulse of Boston's harbor. Yet every great enterprise requires new strength, clear vision, and unyielding nobility. She paused, offering a theatrical, solemn look to the crowd. It is with a heavy heart that I must first address a private family matter, Eleanor's tone laced with manufactured sorrow. Many of you are aware of my son Julian's recent unfortunate lapse in judgment, a hasty private arrangement made in a moment of frail health. I am pleased to inform you that as of this afternoon, that temporary arrangement has been peacefully dissolved. The girl has departed the estate. A soft, approving murmur swept through the socialites in the front rows. Lydia Vance beamed, taking a half-step forward. And now, Eleanor raised her crystal flute high into the chandelier light. It is my greatest honor to announce the historic merger of the Montgomery Maritime Line and the Northern Rail Dynasty, sealed through the betrothal of my son Julian to Miss Lydia Vance. Before a single guest could bring their hands together to applaud, a sharp, clear sound echoed through the hall. The heavy, brass-studded mahogany doors at the top of the grand sweeping staircase swung open. Every single conversation died instantly. 200 heads snapped upward toward the landing. I stood at the top of the marble stairs. I had cast aside the plain wool of the East Wing. I wore a column gown of midnight blue silk velvet that fell in clean, regal lines to the floor. Pinned to my dark hair and resting against my collarbone was the historic Montgomery Duchess Peru, the legendary platinum and emerald necklace gleaming with deep green fire under the chandeliers. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the room. Several older matriarchs clutched their pearls, staring in sheer disbelief at the unmistakable family jewels. Eleanor's face drained of every ounce of color. Her champagne glass tilted, spilling dark red wine down the velvet front of her gown. Beside me, Julian stepped onto the landing. He was dressed in a pristine black tuxedo, standing tall, resolute, and unwavering. He didn't look at his mother. He took my arm in his, and together we began our slow, deliberate descent down the grand staircase into the frozen silence of the room. The click of my heels against a white marble stairs was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the ballroom. 200 of Boston's most elite guests stood frozen, parting like the sea as Julian and I reached the center floor. Eleanor's hands were shaking so violently that her crystal flute slipped through her gloved fingers. It shattered against the polished marble, splattering red wine and glass across the hem of her black velvet gown. "What is the meaning of this insolence?" Eleanor's voice cracked, struggling to maintain its tyrannical pitch in front of the city's nobility. "Security, remove this woman from my house immediately. She is trespassing and she is wearing stolen heirlooms." Not a single guard moved. Sheriff Lawson and 2 federal marshals in dark overcoats stepped out from the arched foyer, standing at ease with their hands clasped behind their backs. "No one is being removed, Mother," Julian said, his voice ringing through the grand hall with an authority that stunned the crowd. Lydia Vance stepped forward, her face twisted in petulant fury. "Julian, have you lost your mind? Look at her. She's a penniless scullery girl trying to make a mockery of high society." "Miss Vance," I spoke, my voice calm, level, and projecting effortlessly to the farthest corner of the mezzanine. "You would do well to step away from that podium before your family's rail bonds are dragged into a federal fraud indictment." Lydia froze, her painted lips parting in shock as the room erupted into hushed, furious whispers. I unclasped the ribbon of the leather portfolio I carried and laid 3 certified documents on the center table directly in front of the bank trustees and the president of the Boston Chamber of Commerce. "For 20 years," I announced, meeting the eyes of the city's most powerful financiers, "Eleanor Montgomery has operated Highcliff Manor and the Montgomery shipping fleet under the false pretense of sole executorship. But she did not build this line, and she does not own the foundation it stands upon." I turned to Eleanor, whose pale eyes were wide with unadulterated terror. "The 1904 Highcliff Harbor Charter was founded as a sovereign partnership between the Montgomery name and my father, Arthur Cole," I continued, tapping the gold federal seal on the vellum. "My father held 49% of the proprietary stock, 60% of the deep water docking rights, and the explicit legal right to reclaim executive oversight if the fleet was ever endangered by fraudulent debt." "That's a lie!" Eleanor shrieked, lunging toward the table, only to be firmly intercepted by Sheriff Lawson. "Nothing is a lie. Arthur Cole was a master mariner who kept every duplicate manifest and registered bonds in the federal vault," Julian declared, placing his hand over mine on the parchment. "And as of 2 o'clock this afternoon, the United States District Court verified the original trust. My mother has embezzled over $200,000 in corporate funds to finance her personal vanity and fraudulent railroad mergers." The room descended into pandemonium. Socialites gasped, bank directors scrambled toward the table to inspect the magistrate's signatures, and Lydia Vance turned on her heel and pushed her way frantically through the crowd toward the exit doors. Federal Marshal Harris stepped onto the dais, pulling a folded white summons from his coat and presenting it directly to Eleanor. "Eleanor Montgomery, by order of the Federal Maritime Court, all personal and commercial accounts in your name are frozen. You are under subpoena for grand corporate larceny and fraudulent conveyance. You have 1 hour to vacate Highcliff Manor." Eleanor looked around the room, desperately searching the faces of her friends, bankers, and social peers she had entertained for 30 years. Not a single person looked back. Every head turned away in cold, unyielding silence. She looked at me, her mouth trembling, the illusion of her royal authority completely shattered. I looked back at her with the quiet dignity she had spent a lifetime trying to steal from others. "You told me I wasn't a Montgomery, Eleanor," I said softly, the emeralds at my throat gleaming in the chandelier light. "You were right. I am a Cole, and you are standing in my house." By dawn, the last of the society cars had rumbled down the long gravel drive, leaving Highcliff Manor in an unfamiliar, peaceful silence. A fresh blanket of light snow covered the cliffside terraces, while the Atlantic surf below rolled steady and clear against the granite shoreline. I stood on the east terrace, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, watching a lone black motorcar crawl past the iron estate gates. Inside that car sat Eleanor Montgomery, carrying 2 modest leather suitcases and 30 years of shattered pride. There was no grand escort, no society farewell, and no champagne toasts. Only the cold morning wind escorting her out of the valley forever. The heavy glass door behind me clicked open, and Julian stepped out onto the terrace. He held 2 steaming mugs of black tea, handing one to me as he leaned against the stone balustrade. The tension that had weighed upon his shoulders for years had completely melted away in the morning light. "The shipyard managers called from the harbor terminal 20 minutes ago," Julian said, a gentle, genuine smile touching his eyes. "The federal marshals have lifted the freeze on operating accounts. The morning shift reported to the docks without a single delay, and the workers' holiday wages have been deposited in full." "And the Vance rail merger?" I asked, taking a sip of the warm tea. "Canceled permanently," Julian answered, looking out over the water. "Lydia's father spent the entire morning issuing public retractions to the Boston newspapers, desperate to distance his railroad from my mother's fraudulent loans." He paused, turning to face me. He reached out and gently took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "You risked everything to walk into that ballroom last night, Charlotte. You could have taken your father's trust documents, cashed out the bonds, and left this estate to crumble on its own." I looked at the gold band on my finger, then out toward the distant harbor, where the smoke from the morning cargo steamers rose into the pale winter sky. "My father didn't spend 30 years building this fleet just to turn it into paper money," I said quietly. "He believed that a harbor should feed the families who build the ships, not the parasites who gamble in the parlor. Highcliff was never meant to be a prison for quiet people. It was meant to be a foundation." "Then let us make it one," Julian said, his voice firm and filled with purpose. That afternoon, Julian and I signed the new charter of the Montgomery Coal Shipping Trust. We restructured the company into a cooperative, guaranteeing fair wages, medical funds, and pension security for over 500 dock workers and their families. The cold, cruel days of Eleanor's reign were gone. As the afternoon sun cast a warm golden hue across the limestone walls of the great manor, I walked through the grand double doors, not through the side entrance, not into the shadows of the servants' wing, but down the center hall as the true and rightful mistress of Highcliff.